Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? For those who don't know me, my name is Amos Giora, and I am the Director of the Institute for Global Security, Law, and Policy. And this indeed is our inaugural event for the Institute. When Professor Jesse Hill and I, who is the Assistant Director, thought about who to bring in as the guest speaker, we searched far and wide, and very quickly it became apparent to us that the best person we could bring in for an event dealing with religion and terrorism is Professor David Little from Harvard University. The reason we decided to bring in Professor Little to discuss religion and terrorism is because from our perspective it is an important issue that must be addressed. And when we decided who's going to address the issue, there is no better person than to bring in who really is the world's foremost expert on the subject. I met Professor Little a couple of years ago in Prague. I had the honor of being on a panel with him, and it was a delight to be with him on the panel then. It is an incredible honor for us that he has agreed to be our inaugural speaker. Professor Little is the Dunphy Professor of the Practice in Religion, Ethnicity, and International Conflict at Harvard Divinity School, and is a prolific scholar, writer, and researcher. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure, sir, to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Amos. I appreciate that introduction, and I very much appreciate it and am honored by the opportunity to participate in this very important interchange between scholars of religion and law professors. We're going to carry this forward, as I understand it, tomorrow morning, and I look forward to that. I think this kind of interdisciplinary interaction is absolutely essential. The title of my talk is Religion and Terrorism, a Human Rights Approach. Soon after 9/11, Mary Robinson, who was then High Commissioner of Human Rights, declared that the attacks on the United States amounted to, quote, a crime against humanity, and as such constituted the severest imaginable violation of the human rights standards that the world had come to adopt and affirm after World War II. Mary Robinson's words, "Violations may not be justified even in the name of Islam," are important because it is exactly religious justifications that were applied to the acts of 9/11 and to subsequent events, actions associated with Osama bin Laden and his progeny and sympathizers. There are two implications, I think, of Mary Robinson's way of formulating the problem. One is that there is a telling connection between religion and terrorism. And two, the best way to understand and combat religious as well as secular terrorism is within the framework of human rights. In this lecture, I'm going to try to do three things. I want to try to clarify, at least in part, the connection between religion and terrorism. Two, I want to try to give some reasons, including religious reasons at some point, why adhering to a human rights framework is the best possible response to religious and other forms of terrorism. And then third, if we have time, and there is a problem there, I would like to talk a little bit about the Bush administration and evaluate how successful or unsuccessful I think it has been in dealing with the subject before us. I also, if I have time, would like to say a word or two about the subject of religion in regard to the presidency and as it bears on the subject before us. If I don't have time, perhaps I can say a word or two about my views on this subject in the discussion period. I do want to allow time for discussion. First, then, religion and terrorism. It is of the greatest interest that Osama bin Laden and his progeny have provided, in effect, a religious version of an emergency appeal connected to considerations of national security in defense of attacks that occurred on September 11th and events, as I say, that have happened after that and are perhaps likely to occur in the future. In his fatwa, or authoritative declaration, Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders, which was issued, you may recall, on February 23, 1998, bin Laden and his associates speak of a, quote, grave situation that Muslims now confront, caused by such activities as the following: occupation of Arab lands by U.S. troops, aggression against the Iraqi people under Saddam Hussein. There was never any love lost, I think we now know, between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Third, the Crusader Zionist, read Christian, Jewish, religious, and economic motives for fragmenting, quote, all the states in the region, such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Sudan, into paper statelets, and through their disunion and weakness to guarantee Israel's survival and the continuation of the brutal crusade occupation of the peninsula. It goes on, all these crimes and sins committed by the Americans are a clear declaration of war on Allah, His Messenger, and on Muslims, and then it concludes, consequently, the ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. End of quote. Of greatest interest to me, and I hope to you, is the following additional statement, which I've just discovered upon rereading the fatwa, which strengthens the case I want to make this afternoon. It's an additional justification for armed attack against civilians. It says this: terrorizing you Americans and allies, while you are carrying arms on our land is a legitimate and morally demanded duty. It is a legitimate right well known to all humans and other creatures. This, I suggest, is a clear reference to what I'll call the law of necessity, which means, of course, when you are or your group is directly threatened with extinction, you have a right to do anything necessary to preserve yourself. The fact that Osama bin Laden invokes this law of necessity, a legitimate right well known to all humans and other creatures, is very interesting, because he's not invoking Quranic justification at this point. He certainly does invoke Quranic justification, but he develops what I'm going to call in a minute a fallback position, fallback moral position, which I take to be of the greatest importance in our discussion. The war on Allah, His Messenger, and Muslims being perpetrated by the U.S. and its allies is understood to constitute an overwhelming threat to the national security of Muslim states, whose highest and most solemn obligation in the mind of Osama bin Laden is to defend the faith and holy sites in the territory of Islam. It is, by implication, such an extreme emergency, such a catastrophic case of necessity, that justifies an extraordinary prescription to launch deliberate and direct attacks against civilians. The same reasoning is found, by the way, in some other documents that I don't have time to report. One such document is the Declaration of Jihad against the country's tyrants, also composed by al-Qaeda and circulated apparently to the followers of al-Qaeda. It discusses how it is that in a combat zone, a Muslim ordinarily required to identify himself or herself as a Muslim may hide that identity. And the reason given in this declaration is precisely that necessity permits the forbidden. And there are other examples of this reference to necessity in some extremist Islamic literature. The Neglected Duty, composed by the Islamic Jihad, who you recall were responsible for the assassination of Anwar Sadat in 1981. The Charter of Hamas also has allowance for what you might call stretching ordinary prohibitions against attacks on unarmed civilians in the name of accomplishing a very important matter of defense. And there are other, I don't have time, they're from Shia Islam. This isn't just Sunni Islam, it's Shia Islam as well. These references to the law of necessity in the literature of Islamic terrorist organizations are important, I think, because they constitute, as I indicated a moment ago, a kind of moral fallback position. There is, as many of you are aware, a big debate within the Islamic community as between those who side with Osama bin Laden and permit the direct attack on unarmed civilians and those who do not. And there are quotations from the Quran which, as an outsider reads, would seem to indicate that that is prohibited. Muhammad is quoted from time to time as saying, when you go forth into battle, do not cheat or commit treachery, nor should you mutilate or kill children, women, or old men. And there's one surah that says, I just came across it, and fight in the path of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits. So there is a lot of argument and disputation taking place within the Islamic community over this very question. And my suggestion is that Osama needed a fallback position. He needs something to ground in face of all this dispute, a kind of a bottom line moral foundation for engaging in the kind of things he does. At least he seems to do what I'm suggesting because he quotes those very things. It's worth noting, I think, very importantly, and I just discovered this fact in preparing, thanks to Amos, for this lecture, I discovered that Osama bin Laden was not the founder of al-Qaeda, but rather a man named Abdullah Azzam was the original spiritual founder of al-Qaeda. And Osama bin Laden and Mr. Azzam fell out over the very question that I'm identifying, that is the direct, deliberate assault on unarmed civilians. Azzam was opposed to it and resisted it. Osama obviously was in favor of it, and Osama, according to the report I read, eventually acquiesced in the assassination of Mr. Azzam in order that Osama bin Laden might take over the leadership of the group. I think that is extremely interesting in terms of the discussion that we're in. It sort of highlights, I think, the tensions within the Islamic community over this fundamental question of direct assaults against the civilians. Now, some comments on religion and terrorism. Bruce Hoffman, in his fine book called Inside Terrorism, points to a significant growth in the 90s of religious terrorism. By 95, says Hoffman, they accounted for nearly half of the international terrorist groups, and I'm sure by now, and I think Amos agrees, there must be a larger percentage of religious terrorists. What are the core characteristics of religious terrorists? I'm gathering here from a number of interesting works on this general subject of religion and terrorism. Let me mention a couple of the titles. Hoffman's own book, a new book by Robert Pape called Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, published just this year. A book by Mia Bloom, an Israeli, Trying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terrorism. Also relevant to this discussion are Mark Juergensmeyer's rather well-known, somewhat older book called Terror in the Mind of God, and then Jessica Stern, a colleague of mine at Harvard and a former teaching partner, a book called Terror in the Name of God. These titles for books on terrorism seem to be very closely interconnected. Those books I have in mind. I also have looked at Philip Hyman's book. He's a colleague of mine at Harvard Law School, called Terrorism, Freedom, and Security, Winning Without War. And I'll come back to that if I have time in the end in talking about the Bush administration and what might be done. Now, a few elaborations of this idea of the core characteristics of religious terrorism. Hoffman says that religious terrorists, in essence, are more bloody-minded and more bloody acting than are secular terrorists. They are much more willing, according to Hoffman, to engage in extensive killings of innocent civilians and others because they picture the thing in these somewhat more cosmic terms. Pape's theory of suicide terrorism is particularly interesting in regard to what I quoted from the statements of al-Qaeda. Pape's theory is that it's nationalism that is the key impulse driving the suicide terrorist in particular, though I think it would, in his mind, refer to terrorism more generally. That is, the idea, according to Pape, is that these terrorists, highly motivated terrorists, are particularly concerned about the occupation of a homeland, and their initial and most urgent impulse is to drive the occupier out. I think, as I say, that fits very well with what I quoted to you from the 98 fatwa of Osama bin Laden. He says that al-Qaeda suicide terrorists are 10 times more likely to come from Muslim countries where there is an American military presence than from other Muslim countries. And Pape also says that the point that U.S. Iraq policy played directly into Osama bin Laden's hands, and he says, quote, "The longer American combat forces remain in Iraq, the greater the risk that Iraq suicide terrorists will seek to mount operations to kill Americans in the U.S." So this occupational motive is very, very keen from his point of view. Pape goes on to discuss the role of religion. He does not consider religion to be the root cause or root motive of the suicide terrorists' interests. Rather, he refers to something he calls the religious difference between the terrorists and the occupiers. If there is a critical difference of religion between those two groups, the conflict, the antagonism, the animosity is likely to intensify. And religious difference, an example would be American Christian and Jewish occupiers against Muslim locals. According to Pape, this intensification that religion adds to the mix leads to three specific things. One, it heightens the understanding of a nationalist contest as zero-sum and reduces the room for negotiation and compromise. Two, it leads to the demonization of the other side, and both to a willingness to die and to kill large numbers of innocents. And three, legitimates martyrdom, or what he calls sacralized suicide. He also touches on what he calls altruistic suicide. You may recall Emil Durkheim, in his famous book Suicide, enumerated three types of suicide: anomic, egoistic, and altruistic. Pape is picking up on the altruistic thing and saying that's very significant and important because the suicide actor identifies critically with the group of which he or she is a member, and that heightens the motivation and the cause and the understanding and so on. I think, although Pape's thesis may be subject to some controversy, I think it speaks very effectively to the al-Qaeda ideology and to the ideology, as I understand it, of a number of the Palestinian terrorist organizations. By the way, I should say that Pape also adds, contrary to some views of terrorists and suicide terrorists, that they are irrational, fanatical, etc., just do the thing because they want to kill people. Contrary to that assumption, Robert Pape argues that they are very rational, they are politically calculating, and they have very definite goals in mind, the ones that I've mentioned, and they feel and argue that suicide terrorism and other forms of terrorism actually are effective, instrumentally effective, in accomplishing those goals. He mentions things like, remember, the U.S. leaves Lebanon under Ronald Reagan in 1983. That is taken by terrorists as a significant victory. Israel's leaving Lebanon, South Lebanon. However, the truth goes, they read that as success. So there are these indications of accomplishment which give further support and motivation to their political rationale. Mia Bloom adds some things. I don't have time to go on about her, but she does make one point I wanted to emphasize. It is the importance of the public support for the activities of suicide terrorism in particular. And she has two audiences in mind. One would be the enemy, that is, say you're communicating a message to your enemy, get out of here or we'll continue to do what we're doing. Also, and the second audience is the support group out of which the suicide terrorists come. So you're, in a way, sending a message back to that group, look, we're accomplishing something, this is to your good. And so long as that support remains, suicide terrorism continues. When it begins to wane and dwindle, it goes down, which I think is an interesting point. She also suggests, this has to do with the public support question, heavy-handed counter-terror strategies, while possibly effective in the short term, over time inculcate a greater sense of outrage and anger, making a formerly inhospitable environment accepting and approving of mounting violence against civilians. And she mentions Israel-Palestine. She herself, as I mentioned, I think is an Israeli. She's quite critical of the counter-terror measures that Israel has engaged in and feel that they have generated the kind of contrary support that she's fearful of the Russians in Chechnya. She also mentions, she's also quite critical of the United States in Iraq, arguing on similar terms that it simply has provoked them in something like the same way, U.S. driven to use, either driven or inclined to use heavy-handed methods, the torture stuff and all that, would simply, on this line of thinking, contribute to the resistance and animosity of the terrorist group. And finally, Bloom, this is a point I want to come back to. Bloom suggests that it's part of the deliberate terrorist strategy, including suicide terrorists, to provoke a government into transgressing the rule of law, human rights, and humanitarian laws, thereby becoming itself an agent of terrorism. Then the battle is on the same plane. So much of this activity is aimed in that direction. And I think that is going to be a very important point I want to come back to. You delegitimate the state by these actions, by driving the state to act the way you're acting. Much of this is consonant with the work of Mark Juergensmeyer, who pictures religious terrorism in terms of a cosmic war between good and evil, metaphysically understood. And my colleague Jessica Stern has talked extensively in her book on terrorism of humiliation and resentment born of historical and other inequalities, which generates the same kind of animosity. Now I want to turn to saying a word about emergencies and human rights. It is not going too far, I think, to suggest that the whole system of human rights and humanitarian law that arose after World War II, I have in mind the Universal Declaration, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the economic one, and the progeny that has resulted from that whole set of international agreements. I say that it's not a stretch to suggest, as I do, that all of this stuff was developed in response to a massive abuse of an appeal to public emergency articulated by the Nazis. You may recall that it was Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, the very emergency article that facilitated Hitler's rise to power in Germany, and thereafter provided Hitler with the opportunity to bring Weimar down and to replace it with the Dritte Reich. Article 48 suggests that, as one interpreter has said, Article 48 provided the Weimar Republic with an unprecedentedly broad basis for the exercise of emergency authority. And what it meant, of course, as we're all aware, was a widespread abridgment or suspension of civil liberties and basic rights. Virtually all of them were eliminated in the name of emergency or necessity. It's also very important to remember that this same necessity justification was a defense in favor of the preemptive use of force outside Germany's borders, because Germany felt in its own mind or at least Hitler said he felt, that these Norway, Belgium, Poland, etc., were bearing in upon Germany and had to be thwarted by military response. So those elements, self-defense, do anything you want to do, anything you need to do in defense of your fundamental survival, becomes, I'm suggesting, an underlying philosophical foundation of the Hitler response. Just a couple of further matters of support. As you may or may not know, Hitler concludes his book Mein Kampf with the chapter Notwehr als Recht, which means emergency or necessity as right. Accordingly, he was a firm believer in the old adage, necessity knows no law, and that principle underlay his entire political philosophy. Anything and everything is justified when the life of the nation is at risk. And Hitler's Führerprinzip, or his principle of leadership, according to which all authority flows from der Führer, was simply an adaptation of a military model, which model, of course, Hitler felt was the essential model under conditions of an emergency, an army model, a military model, top-down and so on, and under those conditions, individual rights and other things must be sacrificed. Well, that's enough to sketch the point I want to make, which is that the rationale for Hitler's record of what the preamble to the UDHR calls barbarous acts, which shocked the conscience of humankind, as we would now say, was precisely founded on this appeal to emergency or necessity. Reign of terror within the country in all of its various atrocious dimensions that we're well aware of, and, if you like, reign of terror outside the borders of the country by the use of arbitrary military force, however and whenever or wherever Hitler thought was appropriate. As I suggested, the fundamental objective, and this is my really important point, the fundamental objective of human rights and humanitarian law was to put limits and restrictions around emergency appeals, to establish what might permissibly be done in responding to an emergency and what might not be done. My friend at Columbia Law School, a name familiar to many of the legal people here, Louis Henkin, has called the UN Charter Hitler's epitaph. I love that. I love that statement, and I want to apply it to the UDHR and to the human rights materials. Mind you, as you well know, in the UN Charter, human rights are prominently mentioned, so I think it's not inappropriate. I don't think Lou Henkin would mind if I were to do that. In other words, in time of emergency, member states are bound under Article 4, for example, of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to report to the Secretary General that they intend to engage in an emergency response. They must list and defend those particular laws and rights that they are in the process of abridging. And they must indicate when the point of ending is and how they're going to get out of this, what are the conditions under which the thing will be terminated, and perhaps most importantly, they may not derogate from certain non-derogable rights which are listed in Article 4 of the ICCPR, such things as arbitrary life-taking, enslavement, cruel and unusual punishment, torture, etc. Under no conditions may those things be carried out, no matter how severe the state of emergency that you face may be. These documents are sensitive to the difficulties faced by states in countering emergencies, but I would suggest this, that the burden of these documents is to place a huge weight upon the shoulders of any state claiming to encounter and be confronted with an emergency. The onus probandi, in other words, is on the state to show cause that it has got an emergency out here and that it is dealing with it in the most restrained and reasonable way possible. That seems to me the burden. Humanitarian law restrictions also follow this. I don't have a long time to talk about them, but in my view, humanitarian law is simply human rights law applied to military or emergency situations, what you may and may not do under conditions of exception, which is what armed combat conditions obviously are. And what I wanted to emphasize as you read through the humanitarian law provisions, there is contained in them what I refer to as the anti-terror rule. For example, in the additional protocols of 1977 to the Geneva Accords, Articles 51 in the first protocol and Article 13 in the second speak of as follows. The civilian population as such, as well as individual civilians, shall not be the object of attack. Threats or acts of violence, the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population, are prohibited. Also explicitly prohibited are acts of reprisal. If you are attacked by terrorism, you may not respond in kind. These provisions and others clearly cover acts done by the military, by functionaries of the state, as well as by clandestine, irregular forces. That's a very important point. And as I said this afternoon when talking about this, in my own view, it raises questions about how we define terrorism when you read this material. Because it looks to me as though terrorism is prohibited for military people, that is, officials of the state as well as non-officials. And usually, as you're well aware, we define terrorism as deliberate attacks on civilians for intimidation or political purposes by clandestine or irregular forces. But I'm suggesting that third defining characteristic should be reconsidered, because I would have thought that terrorism can be performed by either group. In other words, direct attacks on civilians, as well as several of the acts absolutely prohibited under Article 4 of the ICCPR, have now come to be designated as crimes against humanity. See Mary Robinson and so on, with which I opened. These are referred to by David Sheffer, who was Clinton's representative to the International Criminal Court proceedings in Rome. He has called these atrocity crimes. I like that phrase very much. And there is some debate, by the way, as to whether the Statute of Rome, which is the founding document for the ICC, covers terrorism or not. Sheffer himself, in some of his writings, is ambiguous on this. My own view is, now I'm a lawyer, so I can speak with great knowledge. My own view is that as you read Article 7 of the Statute of Rome, which covers no attacks on civilians, it looks to me like referring to terrorist acts. But the political features of that will need to... In any case, my point is I think terrorism is, in some way or another, covered by the documents. I should also say that the UN Charter gets at restraints on self-defense or necessity in the formulation of Article 51, which is, as you all know, the self-defense article, which allows individual or collective self-defense against an armed attack until such time as the Security Council passes judgment and takes measures to protect the peace and security of the international community. That until clause seems to me critical in understanding the restraining features that are, I'm saying, packed into these documents. So my point is huge burden of proof on governments, armed forces, in responding to emergencies. Lest, and this point I made earlier, quoting Mia Bloom, lest you become your enemy. And here may I just take a moment to tell, I love this story. It's about a Russian group of religious people called Doukhobors. And Doukhobors are inclined to run naked in the streets. And this particular Doukhobor was a very fast-running Doukhobor. He was naked, and the policeman comes along, tries to apprehend him, Dukakor takes off, the policeman tears after him, and the policeman's rather slow, so as he's running, he has to peel off one item of clothing after the next. And by the time he gets there, as the little story says, you can't tell one from the other, which illustrates the problem that you're caught in, I think, in this whole idea of restraining, comporting with and complying with restraints, international restraints, and so on. Well, now a word about religion and human rights of a more constructive sort. Got to be brief here. As I hope begins to come clear to you, my thesis is that a human rights and humanitarian law approach, properly understood, constitutes an outside constraint on religious thought and practice. Just as human rights and humanitarian law represent a definitive and compelling answer to Hitler's effort to wipe away all moral and legal restraints in the name of necessity, so they are, in my opinion, the right answer to all similar appeals made on the basis of religion, including those of Al-Qaeda. Mary Robinson was, in my view, absolutely right. Crimes against humanity may not be justified in the name of protecting Islam or any other religion. And the reason I suggest is a fairly straightforward one. In face of the events of the mid-20th century that I've sketched, it seems to me morally unavoidable to believe that each and every human being is bound to regard the barbarous acts alluded to in the preamble of the UDHR, all of which, please remember, involve the infliction of extreme suffering or death on unarmed civilians, with the same shared moral revulsion that animated the writing of that declaration, as we learn from Johannes Morsink's extremely interesting book on the drafting of the UDHR. His term is shared moral revulsion, which unified all the drafters, even though they came from politically and economically and ideologically very different backgrounds. Looking at that array of atrocities, they were all one in responding to it. I'm suggesting that that is some kind of powerful moral foundation upon which to think about the human rights approach that I'm recommending. Consequently, it also seems morally unavoidable to commit to embracing and upholding the basic standards of restraint designed by the drafters to prevent the recurrence of those barbarous acts, and to follow the declaration in holding all people, including religious people, accountable to those standards. That's what I mean about religion and terrorism, a human rights approach. It seems to me that's the context in which we must consider these matters. One key question, then, is how do religions stand on this approach? If they are opposed to it and wish again to invoke necessity, no holds barred, they stand condemned. If, on the other hand, they support the human rights approach, then they are within bounds. And one activity that I've been engaged in, and can't talk about it now, is to look in different religious traditions and find those that have been supportive of the rights tradition, as I called it, which would lead into the human rights approach. I've actually canvassed some Islamic writers, some Jewish writers, at least that far I've gotten. I'll be publishing a paper on this subject soon. But let me say a word very quickly about the Christian tradition, which is the one I come out of and the one I know best. In the Christian tradition, much overlooked and disregarded these days, in my view, there is something going back, not to the Enlightenment, back to the 12th century, Middle Ages, Roman Catholic, mainly monks, who generated something that has now been identified very, very carefully as the natural rights tradition. This was, I'm trying to say, nurtured in, cultivated in the bosom of the church. It wasn't some outside view and so on. It was there all along, and what was critical about it was that it didn't depend, those natural rights didn't depend on whether you were a Christian or not. They were applicable, obligatory on, and accessible to every human being by dint of being a human being. That was the whole idea. Secondly, they could be used against the Christian church, and were frequently, from the Middle Ages right on up. And here I mention the colonization of North America, the colonization of Latin America, 17th century Bartholomew de las Casas, quoting the natural rights tradition against what he regarded as the abhorrent practices, the atrocious practices of the colonists against the natural rights of the indigenous people. My hero, Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, also cited the natural rights tradition against his fellow English colonists for abusing, mistreating in so many ways the Native Americans in the New England section where I I used to abide, I don't, but in any case where I was for many years. So you want to look at those traditions, and my point here, I suppose, is fairly obvious. Human rights is not necessarily in opposition to religious belief. There are potentialities in all religious traditions to go one way or another. That's my view. And, of course, what I'm recommending is that we pick the ones that favor and support and stand against those that do not. Now, do I have a minute to talk about Mr. Bush? Okay, thanks. I'll just take a quick drink. Let's look at the U.S. record. How is the U.S. done in terms of a human rights approach? Well, the short answer is terrible. I mean, it's easy. I don't have to go on and on, but I ought to say a word or two. And I also want to say a word about the religion business that I mentioned before, how that fits into the Bush response. In a nutshell, my view is that the Bush administration overall has an appallingly unsatisfactory record. I think it ranges from selective compliance to grudging acquiescence, I'm talking about the human rights regime, to outright defiance. See the Bybee Gonzalez memo on torture. And we can mention other things. See the plain dealer of the day. The CIA is ushering people over to covert settings where pretty surely torture is engaged in and so on, and either blinking or perhaps encouraging it. But certainly it's in violation of the kind of structure that I've tried to develop here. My view is that Phil Hyman's book, Terrorism, Freedom, and Security, Winning Without War, is extremely good in the way he characterizes the problems with the Bush administration. The whole idea, according to Phil, with using the war on terror already skews the approach, the counter-terrorist approach. Because what it does is to militarize and thus create all the problems that militarization create for a government, a state of exception by definition, all the pressures, all the temptations. And then they haven't even done the militarization very well in that regard. As Phil Hyman makes very clear, he has quite a stinging article on civil liberties and mentioning human rights in passing and the trespassing that's been going on in that regard. Therefore, let me mention two things that Phil says. One is that the war on terror image is the wrong one. What we need are much more surgically designed intelligence and a whole range of other things with respect to dealing with terrorism. He's a little less strong on what to do about terrorism, though he has some proposals. The very important point that he makes in this book, in my view, is that we're doing it the wrong way. At least we're proving that the way we're doing it is incorrect. And then he sketches out alternative ways that might be more successful. That's essentially, I agree with Phil Hyman in that regard, and that's my point. Let me end with a comment on the religion thing. because my view is that Mr. Bush, and this has been labored, I know that you're aware of all this stuff, but my point is, I suppose, in brief, is that the kind of religion that has been invoked by the Bush administration, phrases like America is the hope of all mankind, that hope still lights our way, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, that's a quotation, a distorted quotation from the first chapter of the Gospel of John, in which Jesus is the light that and suddenly America has become, my goodness, I mean, that is simply amazing. And I've got more of these quotes, but the point of it is that what you've done is you focused your religion on the sort of nationalist giving priority to and excuse to the nation, in effect, because it's righteous and religious, to do it rights. That seems to me to be fundamentally... So even the religion reinforces that non-international, if not anti-international, way of thinking. And I've combed through the Bush statements on this with a good deal of care, and I simply haven't found him focusing his religious perspective on the international framework that I have tried to discuss. I'm certainly not suggesting that George Bush is a new Hitler or an Osama bin Laden, and I'm not likely to equate the excesses of the fascists with Mr. Bush's policies. But I am most emphatically suggesting that President Bush and his administration display a distressing lack of historical understanding of and religious sensitivity to the enormous perils that are caused by unrestricted appeals to public emergency and national security. It is because of that lack of understanding and sensitivity, I think, that they fail to grasp the importance of a human rights approach to the challenges of terrorism. And let me end with a wonderful quotation from the Israeli Supreme Court on restrictions regarding the use of coercive interrogation by the General Security Services. This decision by the Israeli Supreme Court in respect to torture, in effect, was rendered on September 6, 1999. I think it's powerful. And let's remember, it's declared by a Supreme Court in the midst of a terrorist environment. What they say is this: the destiny of democracy is that not all means are acceptable and not all practices employed by its enemies are open to it. Preserving the rule of law and the recognition of an individual's liberty constitutes an important component in its understanding of security. And now get this: although democracy must often fight with one hand tied behind its back, it nonetheless retains the upper hand. Thank you very much.
We have time for about 10 minutes worth of questions. Sir.
I don't mean by asking this to justify anything that has happened.
Sure.
But do you perceive a difference in the necessity issue between a Weimar, when an army might advance across your border, or at most aircraft with a range of several hundred miles, and a world of intercontinental ballistic missiles and total destruction?
Well, it certainly raises the ante. I don't deny that. But it also opens the door to abuse. I mean, that's the balance where, and as you intensify the threat, which is what you're suggesting, you also raise the possibility of excessive response. I think Iraq, in a way, is a good example of that. I'm not saying that leaders under these conditions are required to be enormously insightful and sensitive. So I understand the brunt of your point and honor it. But my point is that if you look at Iraq, remember the smoking gun must not turn into a mushroom cloud. Already to raise the threat of nuclear weapons without verification leads to, in my view, a set of enormous disasters, which illustrates my point that as you raise the tension, you also raise the possibility for abuse. And that's what we've got to keep our minds on. And that's what I don't feel we have our minds on in respect to this administration. Yes?
Jimmy Carter was on television this morning making some of the same points you
Oh,
were.
really?
Except he was more definitive than I've ever heard of in the past.
Oh, really?
What is the right way? In other words, you suggested that what policies are now are wrong, and I personally fully agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, how do you deal with terrorists which are under your control, people you feel want to destroy you?
Sure.
How do you deal with them and not come across as someone who would just blindly accept
Sure.
what they've been doing?
And open yourself to the threat that they represent. Let me start by saying you reaffirm the rights of all people at certain levels. Amos and I were talking about this, and he iterated a point that I would also make, that terrorists have rights. And under the Torture Convention, but human rights. They're human beings, and they have some level of rights. And to figure out and affirm that level of rights that they have, judicial rights, etc., is the only way to reiterate the point I'm trying to make, to protect yourself from falling into the position that they're in. So you start out by being as rigorous as you possibly can be about what you owe the terrorist. Then you begin to pick apart what are effective measures. Phil Hyman provides a number. As I say, he focuses extensively on intelligence gathering, sharing, disrupting operations, all the things that you've heard about. I'm no expert in. Amos Goria is. And he needs to talk about those things. Counterterrorism measures that are surgically focused, that are limited, because they are framed by this wider set of concerns that you not feed into the interests and hopes of the terrorists. You not become like the terrorists. So you design those measures, and according to Phil Hyman and Amos and others who seem to know about these things, there are measures that you can adopt. But we do know that the ones we've been taking up are counterproductive. Yeah.
Speaking on that point, this book, Winning Without War,
Yeah.
what's the conclusion it reaches?
Well, that we shouldn't adopt, to use the war metaphor is a mistake. And he shows, that's the breadth of the book, to show how ineffective and counterproductive and self-defeating the strategies used by this administration are. Now, as I say, he proposes a set of alternatives, disrupting various operations which target the terrorists. Intelligence is absolutely key. He wrestles in this book with how far you can go in intelligence gathering and interrogation, etc., and preserving the rights regime that I've been referring to. Phil Hyman is also very concerned to protect that regime for the reasons that I've given. That's the frame in which you do it. I really can't stand before you and give definitive answers about the most successful techniques. Those need to be discussed, and I hope maybe tomorrow we'll talk about those things. But I can only report to you what people like Hyman and others are saying. But it's not that. Yes?
Religious historian Karen Armstrong.
Sorry?
Religious historian Karen Armstrong.
Oh, yes.
She has a running theme throughout a lot of books, from History of God and Battle for God, that it's the monotheism that's arisen
and generates.
Yes, and generates this Huntington classifications of feeling, I guess. I guess I would just like a comment on what do you think? Do you think there's a place for religious syncretism or more acceptance of different religions and cultures, culturalism, so to speak, in your framework?
Did you hear the question? Let me repeat as I understand it. The question, the questioner raises the name Karen Armstrong. She's a British former nun, author, rather popular writing on subjects of religion, Islam, monotheism, and so on. And according to this gentleman, and I think you're right, although I haven't read all of Karen's stuff, she holds the view that monotheism generates intolerance. Wouldn't that be the way to make the proposition? And it does that because it posits an exclusive God. Whether you're a Jew or a Christian or Muslim, you have an exclusive, a jealous God, to use scriptural language, which is going to get you if you deviate, etc. And is that responsible? Well, my response is that that may have something to do with it, and I certainly think you can cite historical examples where that kind of thing has been empirically verifiable. But I also want to say that within the monotheistic traditions, I've already given you a couple of examples, there are countervailing themes. Freedom of conscience, Roger Williams, founds Rhode Island, welcoming Jews, speaking approvingly of Muslims, of atheists, for heaven's sakes. This is 1635, well before the Enlightenment and so on. From within the Christian tradition, you have people advocating the counter theme. And by the way, in the Reformation, as you may know, the Anabaptist wing, the left wing of the Reformation, were fervent Christians, doctrinally very committed to one God revealed in Jesus Christ. But they also argued that you may never use coercion to prompt belief. So on the one hand, their fervent monotheism was not linked to persecution and to suppression of people with other views. In fact, they suffered. The Anabaptist was not as vigorous or influential a movement because they were killed off just by dint of the views that they had. In the Magisterial Reformation, Luther, Calvin, my parentage, spiritual parentage, all prevailed and to some degree wiped out these people, right? So it's also it's an intra-religious struggle within the Christian tradition that I know about in regard to that proposition. There's no logical requirement that belief is wedded to persecution or suppression or repression. I also mentioned I've written, when I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I worked for 10 years in Washington, I studied civic conflicts like Sri Lanka. And I got to know pretty well the case there. A Buddhist country that is predominantly Buddhist, Hindu minority, some Christians, small numbers, some Muslims. But the character of Buddhism in Sri Lanka is anything but tolerant. Traditionally, there are certainly tolerant Buddhists there, but the drift of Buddhism in Sri Lanka is extremely intolerant. There are all sorts of reasons for this, and in a little book I wrote on the subject, I tried to analyze some of these. It has to be understood in historical context, but there it is. Buddhism's supposed to be compassionate, nonviolent, all that. Well, you read some of the discussions, and by the way, you find in the monks of the 6th century AD and so on, the Buddhist monks reverting to laws of necessity. We are under the gun here. These Tamil people are besieging us. What are we going to do? And so, well, I could go on and on, but that's that. You see my point. So I think it's a very mixed question. I think we need subtle discussions of what makes religions tick and what kind of things they are, rather than these rather simple generalizations. Yes, sir.
But aren't we really interested in Islam within the context of modern terrorism against the United States? Okay, and weren't the alleged hijackers of 9/11 not really true Muslims? Okay, but shadowy intelligence agents that engaged in drinking alcohol and womanizing and other egregious actions, which is strictly forbidden for Muslims under Islamic law. So
what do you make of that? I agree with you. What do you make of that?
So it's like, why should Islam be vilified? Sure. when it's like Saudi Arabia wants to give millions of dollars to the 9/11 victims and condemn it all.
Yes, I agree with you. That's in a way the point I'm trying to make, that Islam is deeply internally divided. And these Atta, etc., do not represent anything like the mainstream of Islam, which opposes direct assaults on civilians, terrorism, and so on and so on. All of us wish, and we've shared this with our Muslim friends and neighbors, that more speaking up be done along these lines. Amos and I were talking about that earlier. I think that is terribly important, that this approach to Islam be publicly registered and that it be part of the climate, which would then begin to reduce the sort of attractiveness of terrorism. That's very important, but it's there, in my view. Absolutely there. Yeah.
One last question. David, you talked a bit about the religious tradition's capacity for recognition of rights.
Yes.
You talked about the human rights secular tradition of the law of necessity as a reference point for thinking about limits on transgression.
Yes.
But what are the major religious traditions inform themselves about the law of necessity? I mean, wouldn't that be a fruitful area of inquiry so that there was an indigenous intelligence about...
Yes, in fact, I happen to be writing a book thank you very much, on law and emergencies, on human rights and emergencies. And I'm having a big chapter on the traditions, at least in the West. I don't know that I'll get into Buddhism, but somebody should do that. It'd be a fabulous comparative study of the... I remember, and actually I have in this book a quotation, I mean it's the manuscript, a quote from, I think it's Mencius, who says if you, should you rush to the aid of a person who's outside your group, who's teetering as a child or something, and there's some prohibition against touching this person, so of course you should. Necessity, you leap to your bounds. So necessity can also work in a morally expansive way as well as in a morally shrinking way. And all of that is really important and needs to be looked at very extensively, I agree. Well, I guess we have to stop. Thanks very much indeed.
When we established the Institute, it was our stated goal, it is our stated goal, that we will truly become the leading resource and research center on the great issues related to global security. I'm sure that all of you will agree with me that Professor Little's talk achieves that goal. From our perspective, you did your job beautifully.
Well, thanks.
Thank you. It's a small token of appreciation.
Oh,
Thank you
well,
very much.
thank you kindly. I really appreciate that.
There's a reception upstairs.
Thanks very much. Thank you.